Welcome, greetings all! Ah, you wobbled. You're wobbling. I wanted to try to get a video out pretty quick this time because even though I quite liked my Mona Lisa episode, I was a little disappointed by how it looked. Look at that, all out of focus. Unacceptable. And you know, it took me over a month to get around to editing that because, January was super busy, so I wanted to try to get this one out in a single day. Maybe 2. Or 3. 4? So probably the easiest thing for me to do for a nice quick script is another episode on Shakespeare. We covered Romeo and Juliet back in episode 1, so how about today I cover its sister play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. This was my entry point to the language of Shakespeare as a stage school zygote committing the speeches of Puck to memory, while being encouraged to do these big over-the-top gestures that were the kind of the old-school stage style of that local acting studio. And yeah, this has always been one of my favourites. In all honesty, you know, not all of Shakespeare's plays are masterpieces. Sorry, Shakespeare senpai. But a whole lot of them are, and I have no hesitation in calling this tour de force of comedy writing another great work. So why did I call A Midsummer Night's Dream a sister play to Romeo and Juliet? Well, you know, there's plenty of evidence that they were written at a very similar time, quite possibly in parallel or with this play right after Romeo and Juliet. At the very least, we know it was written by 1598 because that's when it was named in the Paladis Tamia, or Wit's Treasury, which lists pretty much all of Shakespeare's plays written by that point. Pretty much. You left out The Taming of the Shrew there, didn't you, Mr. Maris? And a handful of Henry VI's. But it's also closely tied with Romeo and Juliet through language as one of Shakespeare's lyric plays, or lyrical plays. This is a name given to a group of plays that have a lot of lyricism in them. They're very poetic, they have a lot of speeches that rhyme, that play with different metrical ideas, and you know, there's a lot of attention to the beauty of the poetry. Here's a nice example from this play. I know a bank where the wild thyme blows, where oxlips and the nodding violet grows, quite over-canopied with luscious woodbine, with sweet musk roses, and with eglantine. It's relatively simple, but there's a really nice musicality to it. With that said, there's nowhere else that Shakespeare is more playful with his language. You know, having a play within a play gives him a great chance to mess around and do some very silly things like die, 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 dies. Now, Shakespeare in the style of the time usually writes in blank verse, in iambic pentameter that has quite a natural feeling to it while still being poetic. However, sometimes he plays with his meter and draws attention to the language, which has a bit of an otherworldly or magical effect. You know, he does it elsewhere as well. I mean, think of Double Double, Toil and Trouble, Fire Burn and Cauldron Bubble. Fire Burn and Cauldron Bubble. That was me being a witch from Macbeth. In case that wasn't clear. But yes, that's a fairly regular rhythm called trochaic tetrameter. Tetra meaning 4, so a meter of 4 beats, and trochaic meaning trochees, which is stressed, unstressed. Double, double, toil and trouble. Puck at certain times switches to an odd meter called catalectic trochaic tetrameter, which is 4 beats of trochees, but the last one is cut off. It's incomplete. Lord, what fools these mortals be. He uses this speech when he addresses the audience directly, and it sounds very sing-song. Gentles, do not reprehend. If you pardon, we will mend. But he also often uses it when performing actual magical feats. For example, churl upon thy eyes I throw all the power this charm doth owe. Power, you know, being something we'll accept that Shakespeare saw as one syllable. Now this is a very artificial meter to speak in. It doesn't sound like natural speech. But Puck even leads Oberon to use it when they're bewitching the lovers together. I'll try and do it without the, you know, the comedy Hagrid voice. Flower of this purple dye, hit with Cupid's archery, sink an apple of his eye. When his love doth espy, let her shine as gloriously as the Venus of the sky. When thou wakest, if she be by, beg of her for remedy. Remedy. And of course he also uses it when he actively bewitches Titania. Wake when some vile thing is near. It's a kind of Brechtian alienation technique long before this kind of thing was established. Anyway, the point of all this is that at the time Shakespeare was very focused on the sound and musicality of his language, and that makes it a very good example of the lyric plays of the 1590s. The play is also linked very closely with old Romeo and Juliet through its use of Ovid and the story of Pyramus and Thisbe. Romeo and Juliet is indirectly an adaptation of that story, done in a serious tone with, some funny scenes thrown in, whereas the Rude Mechanical's version of that story is, a very funny take on a classic tale, which is done in a very irreverent way, which suggests Shakespeare was both very keen on the source material and had been very engaged with it while writing Romeo and Juliet. And so here we have a very funny play, but with some touches of darkness in there as well. I also have one little observation that I don't think I've ever seen anyone else make, and it's by no means concrete evidence, but it's a nice little clue that maybe Romeo and Juliet and A Midsummer Night's Dream were written at times very close to one another. As I mentioned in my video about Romeo and Juliet, one of the big stars in Shakespeare's company at the time was Will Kemp. He's referred to by name in the quarto and the first folio of Romeo and Juliet in the role of Peter. But Peter is pretty much a non-role. He has like 10 lines and a bunch of them are just like anon and pretty. And that's kind of a strange way to use your star comedy actor. And maybe he was just doubling the role, but there's not really any other parts in that play that suit him very well. I doubt he was playing Mercutio. So was Shakespeare just wasting one of his most prominent actors? Or was he saving him for a starring role in the next play? Which, for all we know, they were performing simultaneously, or at the very least rehearsing simultaneously. Kemp very likely played Nick Bottom, and this RSC Complete Works helpfully tells me that Bottom is the biggest part in the play, with 12% of the lines. Who would ever have thought that little nugget of information would come in useful? And at the same time, there's not really a very obvious role for Burbage, though from what we know it seems like he just took any good role he could. Bit like Nick Bottom. And there's also speculation that, because this play centres on a wedding, or 3 simultaneous weddings, that maybe it was written as a kind of auspicious gesture to mark a real wedding. If so, the most likely occasion would have been the February 1596 wedding of Sir Thomas Berkeley and Elizabeth Carey, not to be confused with the playwright Elizabeth Carey. This Elizabeth Carey's grandfather was the first cousin of Queen Elizabeth, and the Lord Chamberlain of Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men. So maybe there was an element of flattering a patron here, although ending with a wedding is pretty conventional in the comedy. And it's pretty unlikely that this would have been written to be performed at a wedding, even though I know that's what happens in the play itself. It isn't really something that they did in Elizabethan times. They'd be more likely to have a masquerade or something along those lines, not sit down for 2 hours to watch a play. Now this play is set in ancient Greece, though that setting is really just to seem exotic and maybe to let Shakespeare make up some laws of his own. Otherwise, pretty much everything from the play, from the fairies themselves to the jobs that the Rude Mechanicals hold, is pretty much centred on Elizabethan England. Far more so than when Shakespeare was actually trying to establish a classical setting like Titus Andronicus or Julius Caesar. Not that those are anachronism free, peace, count the clock. And the fairies in particular are very British. In fact, you might be surprised just how much the The belief in fairies and folklore is considered part of the British identity here in Japan. At the time though, fairies were in quite a big way. Spencer had been publishing The Fairy Queen since 1590, and he'd dedicated it to the most mighty and magnificent Empress Elizabeth. In the text there are several queen characters that allude to Elizabeth, most of them very flattering. Elizabeth loved it. You know, she gave Spencer the modern day equivalent of over £10,000 every year for the rest of his life for having written it. As a result, fairies and British folklore became all the rage in England, across the social classes. In 1591, a lavish festival was organised for the Queen in a place called Elvetham, and during the celebrations, an actor representing the Fairy Queen came and gave speeches in praise of Queen Elizabeth. During one of them, she mentions Oberon, the king of the fairies. Now this name derives from various European stories about elves and otherworldly beings that Siegfried had to face. And yeah, maybe Shakespeare was engaging with these original sources, but it seems like in the popular culture of England at the time, this name was already established as that of the King of the Fairies. Titania or Titania is a bit of an odd choice though, deriving of course from Titans, who are in Greek mythology usually perceived as something very, very big. The word Titanic comes from that, whereas fairies are usually perceived as, you know, teeny little fellas. For some reason a lot of online sources say that Spencer uses this name in The Fairy Queen, but he does not. He does allude to characters being descended from Titans. He uses the word Titaness, but never Titania or Titania. So, you know, maybe that's one of the 10 billion words that Shakespeare made up for us. The play follows three main plot lines, which are mostly connected by the mischievous spirit Puck, whose name seems to derive from spirits in the British Isles. Puka in Wales and Puka in Ireland. I don't know how to pronounce those properly. Shakespeare may have got the name from Spencer this time, because in his wedding poem, his Epithalamion, he mentions a spirit called Puck. Or, you know, they might have just had common sources. The main story of A Midsummer Night's Dream, its kind of heart and soul, is about four young lovers. It's a pretty classic setup. Young Athenian woman Hermia is in love with Lysander, and happily enough, he loves her back. Unfortunately, Hermia's father Aegeus orders her to marry another man called Demetrius, who is quite keen on the idea. Under an ancient law, Hermia cannot disobey her father, so to escape from the death penalty, she and Lysander run away into the woods. Demetrius finds out about this and follows after them, and then Hermia's good friend Helena, who is the ex-lover of Demetrius and still loves him, decides to follow after them all. These four are our main human focal point, and perhaps ironically, those four are the hardest to make interesting for an audience. It's always the biggest challenge for a director to make people like these four characters. The second plot follows a group of very silly men as they put on a production of the tragedy of Pyramus and Thisbe. They are amateurs whose day jobs are all, well, mechanical, and yeah, they all have very silly names and they all get very silly parts in the play, like a wall or the moon, a very apologetic lion. The third plot is centered on the fairies. The king and queen, Oberon and Titania, are quarreling. The reason for this is that Titania has spirited away a little Indian boy. Now, the idea of a changeling, which is when a fairy or a troll or another supernatural being swaps a human child for a child of their own, is pretty common in European folklore. Although, you know, when you examine the reasons why this might have happened, it gets pretty dark. And, you know, even as recently as 1895, a woman in Ireland called Bridget Cleary was murdered by her husband, and he claimed that he thought he was just killing a changeling, his actual wife. And the boy in the play never actually speaks a word, and he has a different backstory depending on whether you believe Oberon or Titania, which is quite interesting. But I do kind of wish he'd been given a modicum of development or agency. As it is, he's basically a reason for Oberon and Titania to quarrel. Oberon wants to take the boy to be his kind of attendant, whereas Titania dotes on him and doesn't want to give him up. And of course many people interpret the subtext of this being that actually Oberon just wants control. He's jealous of the time that Titania is spending with the boy when she could be spending it with him, so he wants to ruin that. So Oberon hatches a plan to use a magical flower that will make Titania fall in love with whoever she sees upon waking up. Then she should see a beast of the forest, fall in love with that, and disgrace herself. Can you think of a better plan to shame a fairy queen into giving you the kid they abducted? I didn't think so. Now Oberon's underling, Robin Goodfellow, also known as Puck, puts this plan into action, with a few extra steps of mischief. After stumbling upon the quarrelling lovers, Oberon tells Puck to put the juice of the flower onto Demetrius's eyes as well, because if he looks at Helena, that will sort out their little love square quite neatly, at least as far as a fairy is concerned. Unfortunately, Puck uses the flower on Lysander instead, and he falls in love with Helena. So nobody has what they want, everybody's confused, it's a comedy of errors. It's a great setup for them to hurl some choice insults at one another. You minimus of hindering knotgrass maid, you bead, you acorn! Not only this, but Puck decides to terrorize the mechanicals when he stumbles upon them rehearsing their play, changing Bottom's head into that of an ass, which terrifies all of the others, of course. He then arranges for Titania to see Bottom when she wakes up, and she falls in love with this very peculiar creature. In the end, Titania is so distracted that she lets Oberon get what he wants. He takes the changeling boy, and then he uses his powers to set everything straight again. He makes all the humans think they were only dreaming, he restores Bottom's head, and they make sure that Demetrius is in love with Helena, and Lysander with Hermia, using the flower again, so that when they go back to Athens and talk to Aegeus, he'll see that Demetrius no longer wants to marry Hermia, so Lysander is free to marry her, everything works out neatly. The mechanicals even get to perform their play, and it's so terrible that everybody has a great time laughing at them. Yeah, this sounds a bit mean, but it really is hilarious, and you know, they're good souls. I'm pretty sure they would take it in their stride. Basically, it's like watching The Room, you know, in a 16th century reimagining of what ancient Greece was like. And so the play ends with everyone pretty happy. I have to say there are some dangling, you know, plot details that I would have liked to have seen tied up a little bit better. For one thing, it's a little bit sad that the love square is only sorted out through the use of potions. We can maybe convince ourselves through some textual hints that Demetrius is actually still in love with Helena underneath his infatuation with Hermia. But at least to my modern sensibility, I think it would have been much nicer to have Oberon just lift the flower's effects from the humans like he does to Titania, and you know, something about that dreamlike experience has made Demetrius realize that he really does love Helena more than Hermia. You know, something a bit more human than the effects of a magical flower. Though in a more abstract sense, it can be argued that the point of this whole episode is that love is irrational, and like the magic of fairies, it sometimes changes direction unexpectedly and makes people do crazy things. You know, you can interpret it like that. Second, even though yes, there are remarkably strong female characters in this play, with Titania standing up to Oberon and not giving into his demands until, you know, she's forced, and Hermia rejecting the patriarchal system and what her father demands in order to have her own decisions about her life, and then, you know, Helena being probably the most sympathetic character in the play, staying true to her ideal of what love is, even though she's getting rebuffed and insulted. You know, despite these three strong female characters, I really don't think you can argue that this is a very feminist play. I mean, ultimately, Oberon's, patriarchal dominance wins through. He gets his way, he gets the Indian changeling child, and he gets Titania's attention back. Everything he wanted falls together for him thanks to his, trickery and deceit. Though of course it is worth mentioning that, this is supposed to be fairy society. It runs on its own rules. They're different from us. We're not supposed to be treating them as some kind of providers of a moral compass for us. There are several examples in Shakespeare of genuinely very strong female characters who are really, really admirable and well developed. Then on the other side, there's also, the taming of the shrew. Then there's the whole episode where the lovers start hurling insults at each other, and while it's very funny, some of those insults are not very politically correct anymore, especially with Hermia having a darker complexion. And Shakespeare was given ample opportunity to explore some very interesting themes about, gender politics and racial identity with the setting he chose. The Duke of Athens in this play, who also gets married at the end, is Theseus, and his wife is Hippolyta. Given that she was an Amazon, you'd think that maybe she would have some pretty willful things to say, but she just kind of acts as a default queen figure in this play. And if you know a lot about, ancient Greek mythology, you might think of characters that are supposed to be from Ethiopia, like Andromeda, who is a great beauty, and think, maybe the allusions to Hermia being an Ethiop are literal. Maybe she's actually a person from Africa. But I have to tell you, there will be no ringing of any progressive bells this time, because not only does she also get called a tawny Tatar at another point, Ethiop was kind of used by Shakespeare in other places as just a general term of disparagement, to indicate that somebody was not aesthetically pleasing to look at. Shakespeare is definitely not wrestling with themes of race and prejudice here, and it's a good thing that he had Othello to further develop those ideas. Otherwise, people would be digging his old tweets up, and it'd be time for some cancel culture. And Hermia is also kind of short, so she gets insults like dwarf hurled at her, and so if you're looking for political correctness, I think you might have some issues with this play. Very problematic. Still accepted as a product of its time, the play has proven enduringly popular. The oldest surviving review we have of it is not so good. It comes from Samuel Pepys, and he called it the most insipid, ridiculous play that ever I saw. He had pretty bad things to say about Romeo and Juliet as well, although he did love Macbeth. English composers have had a particularly good reception to this story, with Purcell, Vaughan Williams and Benjamin Britten all having composed music based on the story. Mendelssohn and Carl Orff also wrote incidental music for a theatrical adaptation of the story. Carl Orff actually writing his version when Mendelssohn's was banned by Nazi Germany because of his Jewish roots. And more recently, the Beatles even greatly pleased their fangirls by doing a version of the Rude Mechanicals play. In modern pop culture, you'll often hear references to Oberon and Titania, and actually in Neil Gaiman's Sandman, I think my favourite chapter of that whole comic book was based on Midsummer Night's Dream. The dreamlike qualities of A Midsummer Night's Dream, as well as its, multifaceted take on what love is and what it potentially could be, as well as, the ease with which you can interpret the different fairy characters as symbols for something more universal, have meant it's been very popular as a play that can be analysed in different ways, from psychoanalysis to epistemology, which is the study of what is truly real. And one thing that's particularly interesting about it is that, as far as we know, Shakespeare didn't really have any sources for the main structure of the play. It's something that he created himself, and that's quite a rarity because usually he's retelling another story. I like, in particular, comparing this composition with The Tempest and seeing some of the similarities there. And on that note, I love the fact that this play is so weird. You know, there are fairies dancing around, and there's a local tradesman who gets his head transformed into an ass's head, and then he gets courted by the queen of the fairies. And yet, sure, in the greater context of literature, especially when you consider that he's been reading a lot of Ovid and thinking about metamorphoses, there's probably elements of the Asinus Aureus in here. It's not that weird. But besides what people commonly think of as a Shakespeare play, you know, skull in this hand, gravedigger down there, it's a riot. For me personally though, what I love about this play is its theme of duality. The play is very clearly about two worlds, the real world and fairyland, but that kind of mirroring is repeated again and again. Male and female, love and hate, night and day, authority and rebellion, civilization and wildness, wakefulness and dreaming, mastery and ineptitude, violence and humor, pride and humility, so many. It feels to me like the play hinges on mirror images and opposites. And yes, it's true that the established powers stay in power, the status quo prevails, Oberon gets his way, he gets everything he wants, and then Aegeus doesn't get the marriage that he was setting up, but he's got no reason to complain, and it's a lot better than his daughter just vanishing off with her lover. And then, you get this scene of the aristocracy chuckling at the mere commoners. But it's worth remembering Nick Bottom with that juicy 12% of the lines. I think that the Rude Mechanicals steal the show every time they're on the stage. Their scenes are so funny, they just overshadow everything else in the play. I may be wrong, but I really doubt that anybody cares about Theseus's marriage as much as they care about what Snug's going to do in the role of the lion, or whether Flute's beard really does come in and prevent him from having to play Thisbe. And yes, as I said before, the kind of heart and soul, the backbone of this story is centered on the young lovers, but it's the silliness that wins through every time. And I'd actually say that's probably more central to any conception of the British identity than Folklore and Fairies are. And it's worth remembering that one remarkable thing about Shakespeare is the assurance with which he can switch from comedy to tragedy. How another duality we should think about is Romeo and Juliet and A Midsummer Night's Dream, a comedy and a tragedy with so many things in common, probably written consecutively, yet so massively different in impact and tone. Without doubt, I would place A Midsummer Night's Dream alongside Romeo and Juliet as another great work. That's all for today. Join me again next time for another great work.